This is Run with FitPage, your audio encyclopedia for all things running. Learn, train, improve. And now your host, Vikas Singh.
Our guest for the podcast today is Matt Fitzgerald. Matt is a well known coach in the endurance community. He has been an all state runner in high school and he took up triathlon in his 20s. He has coached runners and triathletes for the last 20 years. He holds certification in sports nutrition, has consulted for numerous sports nutrition companies, and provides peer reviews for sports nutrition journals. Matt is also an acclaimed endurance sports writer whose work appears regularly in Outside, Men's Journal, and other publications. His many books include the best selling Racing Weight and Iron War, which was nominated for the William Hill Sports Book of the Year award. In this episode of the podcast, we will discuss his journey of being a coach, the 80-20 methodology, training in different weather conditions, and a lot more. Let's welcome Matt to the show. Matt, welcome to Run with FitPage. It's great to have you.
It's great to be with you.
Cool. We'll spend a lot of time today talking about your book, which we are a great fan of. But in addition, we'll also talk about your journey as an athlete, also as your journey as a coach and a nutritionist, and how you have helped runners as they went on to become a better version of them. How would we get started with a small introduction from your end, specifically how running happened to you?
Yes. Well, first of all, I'm coming to you from California, the West Coast of the United States. I grew up on the opposite coast, the East Coast, in the state of New Hampshire, close to Boston. And way back in 1983, my father ran the Boston Marathon.
Oh, wow.
I was 11 years old at the time, and my whole family went to watch him. And I have two siblings, two brothers, and the three of us actually ran the last mile of the marathon with my dad and crossed the finish line with him. You could never do that today, but again, this is a long time ago. And it made a very powerful impression on me. And I started running immediately thereafter and have been running mostly ever since. My father is also a writer. And so I gained an interest in writing from him as well. I didn't grow up necessarily thinking I would end up writing about running, but I do.
Great. And so it's obvious that as you gained experience in running, your interest continued to grow, and then you decided to become a coach. Was it incidental? I heard in one of the videos that you were an undergrad with English as your subject. How from there did you move to nutrition and being an endurance coach both?
Yes, I ran throughout high school here, and I intended to run in college, but I kind of burnt out on the sport and quit. So I did not end up running in college, and actually got quite out of shape and gained a lot of weight. But after I graduated from college, I moved to California, and I just was looking for a good writing job, and the job I happened to get was with an endurance sports magazine called Multisport. And it was just a matter of, so I was 24 years old then, and just being in that environment reawakened my interest in running, and I got into triathlon from there, and I was writing about these sports all the time, and I really didn't consider myself much of an expert. I had some experience, and I was gaining more experience all the time. But eventually, I just felt people would ask me to coach them, and I felt that I had enough knowledge, enough experience to be able to competently coach people. So I started doing that while also continuing to write in 2001.
Sure. And since then, you have come a long way. We see your training program has been one of the most famous one across the globe, and a number of runners definitely benefit from it. I do remember signing up to this plan a few years ago, and I trained as well. And so the next question is going to be around training. As people get started with their training plans, specifically for a half marathon or a full marathon, like an endurance sport, how should how should people think about their training? What are the building blocks of training? And how you as a coach would suggest someone to get started? specifically for recreational runners who might have marginal to not very significant running experiences?
Yeah, no matter how much experience or how little or how ambitious you are or what your level of talent is or how old you are, you need to start where you are. If it's absolute zero, running is a high impact sport. So that can be the toughest adjustment for a lot of people. It takes time for your legs to develop the durability to be able to handle repetitive impact without breaking down. So you need to ease into it. If you're younger and you have a lower body weight and you've been doing other forms of exercise, you can start at a slightly higher level and accelerate more quickly. But endurance sports, they're a long journey. So you need to start with a reasonable assessment of your current capacity, and then build gradually from that point. you know, I really believe in borrowing the best practices of the best runners. So that's really what my program is. And that, that may sound like, how can I possibly train the same way an Olympian does? But you can. Not only can you, you should. You just scale it down to your level. But the people at that level, they don't want to waste their time with inefficient training practices any more than we do. In fact, less so. So, you really want to get the most benefit out of every minute you invest into running. And that's what my 80/20 programs are all about, just kind of distilling the practices, the training methods that seem to work best at the highest level, making them available to everyone. And it's actually a somewhat easier way to train than the way most people instinctively do if they just wing it and do it without a program. Typically, what the average self-coached recreational runner does is do everything at a kind of a moderate intensity, not too easy, not too hard, everything in the middle. And that's a terrible way to train. It's very inefficient, and you'll actually feel better and experience quicker progress if you do 80% of your training at a truly low intensity and the other 20% at a moderate to high intensity. That's what the elites do. They just do a lot more total running than most of us are capable of doing.
Sure. So let's talk about training intensities a bit more. It is a lot easier for experienced runners to figure out their training intensities. I've had experiences when speaking with runners, and they would say, hey, they just cannot run more than 100 meters. They cannot run more than 500 meters. And when I go and talk to them about their paces or perceived efforts, I would see they're possibly going all out. And so they're never able to go beyond that distance.
Yep.
And this is not necessarily because they don't want to run slow, but possibly they don't know how to run slow or what is the right effort as they get started. So what are these training intensities that people should adhere to, and more importantly, how do they even identify that these are my training intensities?
Yeah, so I just threw out terms like low intensity, moderate intensity, and high intensity, and everyone has a basic understanding of what that is, but the specifics matter. So what exactly do I mean by low intensity? Like, where does the boundary fall between low and moderate? And exercise scientists, they themselves have debated this question
Okay.
because there are a lot of different ways to measure intensity. But it seems like the crucial threshold, the one that every runner needs to be aware of relative to themselves, is what's known as the first ventilatory threshold, or VT1. That is a relatively low exercise intensity where there's an abrupt spike in your breathing rate. It's not where you hyperventilate. That's a separate threshold at a higher intensity. But this threshold falls usually for most people between 77% and 81% of your maximal heart rate. And the reason that line is important is that most recreational runners, when they just do self-guided training, they just by feel choose an intensity that's slightly above it. But you want, when you're doing that 80% that's supposed to be easy, you want to be below that threshold, because even though it's a slight difference from going just below it to just above it in terms of your perceptions, there's a big difference in how stressful it is to your body and how long it takes to recover from that effort. So it's not that training above, in that moderate intensity range above the VT1, it's not bad for you. It's just a bad idea to do your easy runs there, to spend too much time there. So what you want to find out where that threshold is for you, and there, that requires a little bit of testing. There are various ways that you can measure it by heart rate or pace or power. If you have a stride, if you have like a run power meter, you can do it by perception of effort, but most people have to calibrate their perception of effort first. And the easiest way of all to do it, and this is actually scientifically validated, even though it doesn't sound like science, is the good old-fashioned talk test. The VT1 falls at the highest intensity at which you're still able to speak comfortably. So that's just a way to do it. Sort of, once you identify your intensities, you can kind of check yourself, keep yourself on track in any run. Just if you're able to speak comfortably out loud, you're okay. If you're not, you need to slow down.
Got it. And so that is the intensity at which people could look to hover around about 80% of the times in terms of mileage and time they're spending on their feet, isn't it?
That's exactly right. So yeah, the idea is not to go slow all the time. That 20% is crucial.
Right.
But most people, what the science has shown is that the average recreational runner spends about 50% of their time at moderate intensity, and that's way too much.
And I'm going to behave absolutely like a beginner, so pardon me. But then my next question is going to be, that is, if I spend 80% of the time doing the moderate intensity or low intensity workouts, what is it going to do to me in terms of training? Is it going to help me with my aerobic base, endurance, or speed, or all three of these?
It's mostly that. Let's say that you spend 5 hours per week running, and you're currently doing the 50% thing, and you take those same 5 hours and you adjust it. So you're not training more, but you're just doing 80% low intensity versus only 50%. So it's the same amount of training. And actually, it's important to understand you probably don't have to slow down your easy runs very much. It's just you're doing them a little too fast and you need to slow down a little bit. And it's like a small difference that has a big impact. So, it doesn't look like you've changed much at all. But what's going to happen is that those same 5 hours of training you're doing, your body will just be able to absorb them better. So just because you've run a mile doesn't mean you've benefited from that mile. If your body's not having an opportunity to recover from and adapt to that stimulus, you're actually not getting the full benefit from it. So by making that first small adjustment, you're simply going to recover better from the same amount of training, those same 5 hours, and actually gain more fitness from them. And the first thing you'll notice if you make that change is that you'll just feel more comfortable. Your easy runs, it can be a psychologically difficult adjustment because you're breaking a habit, but physically it's going to feel a little easier. And then when you start your next run, you're just going to feel a little bit fresher. And then within a few weeks, you'll start to notice that you're actually able to go faster at that same heart rate or that same perception of effort. So you've already gotten a little bit fitter just by making that first small adjustment. What a lot of runners find after that, there are lots of ways to keep the ball going after that, but a lot of runners will say, "Oh, I couldn't possibly run any more than I do now because I'm tired all the time." But what they find after making that going from 50-50 to 80-20 is that suddenly they feel like, "Oh yeah, I could run way more than I do now," because they feel better.
So how about the remaining 20% then? What purpose would it serve if I were to be at a much higher intensity than the moderate intensity in the remaining 1 hour of that 5-hour training, for example, in a week? What are some of the major functions of this training? How does this help a runner, specifically recreational? I'm sure it helps the elites exactly in the same way, but how about recreational ones specifically?
Yeah, one important concept for that every new runner should learn at some point is that there's no single best workout or single best intensity. You want to do some of everything. You want to cover the full range of intensities. It's just all a matter of how you balance them. So we've covered the 80%, which is low intensity. That 20% is actually a pretty broad range, all the way from about 80% of your maximum heart rate, which is, still jogging all the way up to a full sprint. So there's lots of different stuff you can do within that range, and you should do some of all of it. Even if you're training for a marathon, you should do some very short, very fast intervals. As a complement to that 80%, that type of training, even though it doesn't look a heck of a lot like marathon running, it will improve your running economy, which is just how efficiently you run. It will help further increase your aerobic capacity, so your ability to process oxygen when you're running. It also, that type of training actually improves pain tolerance, or just your tolerance for discomfort, which you're going to be thankful for when you get toward the end of a marathon. And then there's so it's not just the extremes though, sprinting or jogging. There's stuff you do in the middle. For a lot of people, like a half marathon or a marathon is a moderate intensity. So even though most runners are doing too much training in that range, you still want to do some targeted training in the moderate intensity range. So like tempo runs where it's like you just they're a little slower and more extended than the high intensity intervals, but still a good, honest workout. So you want to do some variety, change it over time, and also try to be specific to your event. So if you're training for a 5K, which is shorter and faster, you'll want to do a little bit more of the high intensity versus moderate. If it's a half marathon or marathon, a little more of the moderate versus high.
Okay. A lot of information and very, very useful. So the book that you wrote, 80/20 Running, was this primarily driven from some of these issues that you might have faced among recreational runners? That was the misinformation or information that existed, whether they were spending that 5 hours in 50/50 or they were doing 100% in one versus other intensity. Was this the inspiration that you wrote that book?
Yes, I've written a number of books, and each one of them is intended to solve a problem. And for a long time, I was coaching runners and triathletes, and I also interacted with a lot of other coaches. And I saw that there was very broad, almost universal consensus that the most common training mistake that endurance athletes make is getting caught in what I call the moderate intensity rut, doing their easy training too hard. So it wasn't just my observation, it was pretty much every experienced coach's observation. And we all knew this, but we struggled to correct it because first of all, there's a buy-in problem. A lot of runners conceptually they can't wrap their head around the idea that they'll be able to race faster if they train slower. Also, it's just it's habits are hard to break. A lot of factors would come together and keep people stuck in that rut. So in going back to a couple of years before I wrote that book, I started noticing research by an American exercise scientist who works in Norway. And his name is Stephen Seiler. And he did a lot of research on the training practices of elite endurance athletes. So not just runners, but also cyclists, swimmers, triathletes, rowers, cross-country skiers. And what he discovered is across the board, all around the world, endurance athletes at the very highest levels do this 80/20 thing. And that was no surprise to me at all. But to me, it simplified things. We all recognize that elites are elites. They're better than we are. So we ought to pay attention to what they do. And also, it was just a nice, simple, that ratio. I thought it might make it easier for athletes to give them something to hold on to in terms of, it was like a different way to present the same advice. And that turned out to be true. Instead of just telling athletes you need to slow down, I would say, hey, you need to do the 80/20 thing. And for whatever reason, I got more buy-in that way. And I had a lot more success in sort of converting athletes out of that moderate intensity rut.
Nice. Yeah, yeah. It's actually very relatable. The analogy of this is pretty good. So the moment you say 80/20, then people by default know that it's out of that 100%. And then as you start to explain, it just sticks on with people for much longer period and fairly quickly. Okay, I wanted to move to your experience as a nutritionist, and I want to take some questions. There are some from the listeners and also a few that we prepared for you. But before that, I have one training question to ask, and this is about training in humid condition and adjusting for cooler environment, cooler weather races. How should one go about? Why I'm asking it, just to give you some background where we are currently. Mumbai is generally humid throughout the year. For example, now in May, it's about 34, 35 degrees Celsius with about 70 to 90% humidity. And it only increases up to 100% humidity in June, July. And our coolest temperatures of trainings are, I guess, around 22 to 24 just for a few weeks in a year. And so what happens is when runners are training here and they have to travel overseas or to other places where the races are happening in much cooler temperature, the acclimatization as well as adjusting the paces become an issue. So my first question was going to be, that is, as you train in humid conditions, how can you adjust for your paces when you go overseas and you are racing in much cooler weather?
The good news is that that's actually to your advantage in the sense that everyone can run faster in cooler, drier conditions. It's similar to training at high altitude for a low altitude race. The training is harder. You can't go as fast if you're at high elevation, but you adapt to that, and then when you go to low elevation to race, you have an advantage over people who don't train at high elevation. It's a little different with humidity, but I just would want it to be clear that even though you might not be used to cool conditions and you might feel uncomfortable, it's actually physiologically it is to your advantage. In terms of making the one of the athletes I coach right now lives in Mumbai, and something we have to deal with his training is I mean again you can't train quite as fast. So you simply have to work with the conditions you have. So all intensities are relative. That first ventilatory threshold is still going to be 77 to 81% of your maximal heart rate. It's just that you're going to hit that heart rate at lower speeds. So you train essentially the same way. It's just everything is a little bit slower. And in terms of being able to adjust for, let's say that you're a more competitive runner. Maybe you've run 3 marathons and you want to set a new PB in your next one, and you want to know, okay, well, what am I capable of? If I am going to Chicago to race, you can make adjustments. There are calculators that do it, but mostly you just you do different types of workouts to get a sense of what's possible, and then you get some practice at what you think is a realistic race pace for you. So just for convenience sake, let's say it's 5 minutes per kilometer. That's your goal marathon pace. Well, you're not going to be able to sustain that pace as long in Mumbai as you would be able to in Chicago, just in training. So what you'll do is just shorter efforts. So you get some practice at that pace. So you know what that pace feels like. Your body gets used to it, but you're not forcing something that's not realistic given the conditions. So those types of adjustments. It's not a radical change in how you train, but just a reasonable adjustment to your environment.
Sure. I think one of the cues that I took from the conversation, the answer that you were giving, that was that instead of pace, the training could be a lot more relatable and understood if one is training at certain percentage of their heart rate, because like you said, the VT1 is going to be the same, or any other effort is going to be same. It's just that it will hit much earlier in terms of paces. And so if people keep training as per that, and that is how maybe they went about racing as well in the race, that could be one strategy that could just work.
Yes. You can still train by pace in a hot, humid environment. It's just whatever testing you do to base your zones on has to also be in that environment. If you do a threshold test in Chicago and and get pace zones from that and try to use those zones in Mumbai, that won't work very well. But if you do the testing in Mumbai and then train there, you're okay. You can still train by pace, but but then you do have to make that adjustment in terms of how fast you'll be able to run on race day. So heart rate is a physiological measure, so it is different. Whereas pace is an output. So it's just a little bit. You can train with the metric you want. You just have to understand its limitations, or how different types of adjustments are needed for heart rate than for pace.
Fair enough. Okay, moving on to the nutrition side of things. And my first question is very basic question. In context to a recreational endurance runner, what is the role of nutrition? Should people need to start thinking of nutrition differently than they would think in their regular normal lives if they were not training?
For the most part, no, because the way I explain it is that aerobic fitness, for the most part, is simply an extension of health. VO2 max, or aerobic capacity, is one of the strongest predictors of health in old age and longevity. So, the same measurement that an exercise scientist might use to determine who has the capacity to go to the Olympics in running is also a very good indicator of health. So health is really the foundation of fitness. And so if your diet is oriented towards maximizing your health, you're not going to have to change it much just because you start running. There will be some changes that are required for, you're going to be burning more calories, so you're going to need more fuel from food. Timing becomes a slightly more important issue, just making sure you have enough time between meals and your workouts, and also that you get nutrition in relatively soon after big workouts, because that those nutrients are the raw materials for the recovery processes. So there's some adjustments are often required as you become a runner, but assuming you already eat in a healthy way before you start running, you won't have to kind of start over with your diet.
Okay. Now, more specifically on the training days, how about nutrition on different training runs? Here I'm talking about fueling and hydration both, before, during, and after. On certain days, people need to fuel themselves differently than on the other days. And what I have seen, the requirement here has been specifically because of the weather condition. Water and electrolytes have been a lot more important even on shorter runs. But of course, during the longer runs, it becomes a lot more important to keep in mind the fueling, what you're eating when you're running, etc., and also what you ate before that. And I wanted your help in how should people plan their days from a fueling as well as from a hydration perspective through the week.
It's a matter of habit for everyone, and I tell people you should run when it's convenient for you. So if it's most convenient for you to run early in the morning, you can make that work nutritionally. If it's more convenient for you to run after work in the evening, you can make that work too. As a general rule, you do want to be well fueled for your runs. If you're very fit and it's an easier run, it doesn't really matter. You can wake up in the morning after the overnight fast, go out the door and run on an empty stomach. You'll be fine as long as you're not running a marathon. But for the most part, you just start with what is your habitual daily routine, and then make your nutrition fit around that. First thing in the morning is typically the most challenging, because it's the ideal scenario. If it's a race, you want to have a full meal, typically centered on easy to digest carbohydrate, and then you want to have a couple of hours for that food to clear your stomach, so that you have the benefit of sort of a full fuel tank nutritionally, but also not the discomfort that comes from running with a full belly. So obviously not every training run is a race, so it doesn't have to be perfect. Sometimes it's just a matter of you wake up and maybe have a little bit of yogurt or a banana or something, just to get a little bit of fuel. Wait 20 minutes, stretch, and then do your run, and it's better than nothing. For very, very important training runs, if it's your longest longest long run before a marathon, you'll want to treat that more like a dress rehearsal for your race. And to some extent, you want to do that throughout the training process. So whatever you're going to be doing on race day for fueling, you want to build those habits in training. So not just what you do to fuel for the run itself, but what you consume during the run. So on the hydration side, the liquid side, you want to drink ad libitum, which means just like by your preference. Our bodies were really not designed to take in nutrition while running, so it's not always comfortable for people, and you have to build a habit around that too. So you don't want to force yourself to consume more than you're comfortable doing, because that'll only slow you down in the long run. But at the same time, you want to try to take in nutrition on a schedule, like every 15 minutes throughout your runs, and just take in whatever amount you feel comfortable taking in, in those increments.
I have a couple of questions here. One was, before you start the run, the role of caffeine has been long debated and promoted as well. What's your take on consumption of caffeine before a run?
Yeah, I mean, caffeine is definitely performance enhancing for most runners. There is some genetic variation. Not everyone gains an advantage, but it seems that most runners do. You probably know if you're caffeine sensitive, or if you have a bad reaction to caffeine. So it's probably not. If that's the case, it's probably not something you do anyway. But for the rest of us, it's clearly performance enhancing. It enhances performance in endurance athletes, mainly by lowering perceived effort. So it acts on your brain. Just the same way that you might have a cup of coffee or black tea in the morning, just to be more alert and it perks up your mood. Well, those same effects actually allow you to run faster, because whatever your normal pace is will feel slightly easier if you have caffeine in your system. There's not really much debate about that. There's a little bit of debate about the effect of habituation. So if you drink coffee every morning, will you gain as much benefit from the caffeine performance-wise as if you normally don't use caffeine, or if you take a break from coffee for a week before your race? The science kind of goes back and forth on that question.
Okay. Now, during the run, specifically around long runs, how much carbohydrate people should be consuming when they're running every few minutes or every hour? Is there science behind that as to how many calories should you be consuming per hour or such? And also, how much should be your long run at minimum that you need to consume or fuel yourself during a run?
If we go to, again, like a race circumstance where performance matters, right? You want to get to the finish line as quickly as possible. You want to use nutrition to your advantage, because you're going to go to your limit. In that scenario, about 60 to 70 minutes, an hour to hour and 10 minutes of racing is the threshold above which your performance will benefit if you consume caffeine. So, if say, you're going to run a 10K and your time is around 50 minutes, it's very unlikely that you would benefit from consuming carbohydrate during a run, a race of that distance. But above about an hour, that's where it starts to make a difference. And what the research shows is that the more the better. There's a dose response effect. So the more you're able to absorb, the more your performance benefits, because you can't possibly consume carbohydrate at a rate that will keep up with your need for it, or the rate that you're burning it. So the actual limiter is not where you stop benefiting, it's how much you can actually tolerate. And again, as I said before, humans were not really designed to consume nutrition while running. So that's where you're going to hit your limit. There's a broad agreement that 60 grams per hour is a good number to aim for events in the 1 to 2.5 hour range. And beyond that, actually, you can go up to 90 grams per hour. That's a lot easier to do with cycling, which is, you don't get that jostling of the stomach. You're not going up and down and having the repetitive impact. So a lot of this research is done in cyclists, and they're like, "What's your problem, runners? Why can't you take in that much?" So you have to do. And there's a, I've worked with some runners who have a hard time taking in any carbohydrate during long runs, and others who just seem to have a cast iron stomach, and it seems like they could have a full meal while they're running. So you have to kind of see where you are. But the thing is, like, it's similar to the moderate intensity rut, where people don't realize the mistake they're making. Like, it's almost all runners are not taking in enough carbohydrate, even during their marathons. And so that's free performance you're giving away. It's right there for the taking, and you're just not taking it. So you need to start by measuring, like, just quantifying how much carbohydrate am I actually taking in, and can I get up above that 60 grams per hour threshold. You don't need that. Again, that's a race. You don't need to do that in every training run, but you need to get some practice at that level, and definitely do any run that is long enough or hard enough to leave you moderately to severely fatigued. You're going to benefit from taking in carbs during that type of workout as well.
Okay, and people can try some of these very similar exercises during their training runs. That is, for example, if 60 gram an hour is a threshold that people should look at, then should they be attempting the similar amount of energy they are taking per hour during trainings as well, or it could be less and more, and see what dials in well with them, and then go with it.
Yeah, I make a distinction between sort of key workouts. I mean, because you do a lot more workouts than you do races, right? So you don't necessarily have to, just like with other things, you don't necessarily wear your fastest shoes for every run, right? So certain things, are for races, and you don't have to do them always in training, but you need some. Yeah. So, let's say, you're a marathoner, and you've gotten to the point where a 20-kilometer run is no big deal. You know what I mean? Like, it takes some time. You're a little tired afterward, but it's not like it's hard to run that far. At that point, you could just take in 30 grams of carbs per hour, just enough to get a little bit of a bump from it, and don't worry about it. But if it's a long run, that's more toward your limit or testing your range, where you're going to be quite fatigued at the end of it, that would be one where you would want to aim closer to the 60 grams per hour. And you want to reserve it, at least a couple of key workouts where you try to do things exactly the same way you plan to do them in the race, just for familiarization, and also because they call it training your gut, just like, so it's on race day, it's not the first time your body has experienced what it's like to take in that amount of nutrition.
Makes a lot of sense. How about nutrition after the run, specifically after the long runs? Should people look to consume certain amount of protein or carbohydrate within certain amount of time after they have completed their runs, or it's not necessarily needed? I'm not talking about racing as much. I'm talking about training generally.
The most important thing is your sort of 24-hour nutrition. So that's step one. It's just making sure that you're getting enough carbohydrate, protein, fat, everything to meet your needs over a 24-hour period. That being said, after particularly taxing runs, your harder training sessions, again, the ones that leave you moderately to severely fatigued, you'll get more benefit from nutrition you take in like the first 90 minutes after completing one of those runs than you would if you wait. What some research is showing is that when there are moments when your body's need for calories gets ahead of the supply of calories, it negatively affects your metabolism, and also your recovery. And recovery is just the first step of adapting to training. So that's kind of the way you need to think of it. It's almost as if you haven't even completed your run, until you've taken in some energy or some nutrition to fuel the recovery process. So the research has changed a little bit. I remember, 15, 20 years ago, nutritionists like me all had our hair on fire about, the recovery window after exercise. Like you need to like finish the run and just start, guzzling nutrition as quickly as possible. The latest research is showing it's not quite that urgent, but it still is. Again, you'll get more benefit if you from calories you take in and within 90 minutes of finishing a run. And again, there's a distinction between if it's a half-hour recovery run, no big deal. But if it's a 2.5-hour long run, that that's good. You want to flag that type of run to pull out your best practices for recovery nutrition.
We covered a lot around what should people be consuming in terms of food or gels, etc. during the runs, during training, as well as during racing. I also wanted your expertise around water or hydration in general during long runs, and specifically in humid and hot conditions. How should people approach it on an hourly basis when they're going out and running? Do you suggest certain calculations how people should approach it, or it could be generalized for people?
That Latin term ad libitum is your guideline, and that means basically means by feel or by preference. In the old days, what nutritionists were taught to do is have athletes weigh themselves like before and after a run to measure their sweat rate, and then try to prevent any weight loss by drinking that amount, the amount drinking at a rate that would offset anticipated fluid loss. And what was discovered is that that's a good way to get a runner to throw up because nobody can drink that fast. You're actually supposed to get a little dehydrated when you exercise. Like, your body sweats for a reason. It helps keep you cool. And that's not to say that there's no need to consume fluid while running. But you have that problem where, we weren't designed for it. It's uncomfortable. If you try to drink, especially, if you're at a higher intensity or you're in, warmer, more humid conditions, it's simply impossible to completely offset fluid losses. And also, what the research is showing is that everybody has a maximum rate at which they are comfortable taking in fluid. And if you exceed that rate, no matter what the numbers are, you'll develop GI distress. And if you do that, your performance suffers. So the amount doesn't even really matter. You can't give anyone a number and say, go for that, because they may or may not be able to reach that number. So it's highly individual. You just need to be, what I used to say is drink by thirst. The trouble with that is that a lot of runners don't really pay attention. They could be running thirsty for 20 minutes and not even be thinking about it. Right. So you need to be mindful. You need to pay attention. That's why I said earlier, try to get in the habit of drinking on a schedule every 10 minutes, every 12, every 15. You wouldn't want to go any longer than that. And then each time you do drink, you think about what is an amount I'm comfortable taking in, now, and then you might be a little less comfortable. Every time I run a marathon, I get to the last fluid station at, I don't know what it is, 38K or whatever, and I just pass it right by because my stomach says no more. I've been fine up to that point, and right, exactly. So and I will say that it is. We all tend to be thirstier and are able to drink more in warmer, more humid conditions. So it's not as if you have one fixed rate. That is your optimal drinking rate for all conditions. So that much you can count on. If it's cool and dry, you simply won't experience as much thirst, and you won't be comfortable drinking as much. So your personal rate is flexible, and you want to take advantage of that. If you are running in warm, humid conditions, you should be thirstier, and you should take advantage of that by drinking more. But again, don't try and force down more than you're comfortable with, because it will backfire.
True. Yeah, just it should not be that you wait to get extremely thirsty and then you take a gallon down. It's not going to go down very well for sure.
Right.
Okay. I have one last question on nutrition that is around the ranges or ideal ranges for nutrients for specifically macronutrients for endurance sport athletes, specifically runners. Do you suggest carbohydrate, protein, and fat to be in a certain percentage that they should be consumed on a general basis? So, where should people be consuming their daily calories from? Is there a range people can look at as a guideline or something like that?
That's a tough one because if you look at what elite runners do. I have a book called The Endurance Diet where I traveled around the world eating with and studying the diets of elite endurance athletes in various sports. So I went to Kenya and spent time with elite runners there. I went to Canada, spent time with elite cross-country skiers, went to Brazil, spent time with elite triathletes and so on. And one of the common out there, and I was looking for common patterns, and one of the common patterns is that without exception, all of these athletes maintain what I call a carbohydrate-centered diet. So it wasn't any, very few of these athletes actually, counted, macronutrient percentages, but their habit was a diet that was predominantly carbohydrate. I don't know what the situation is with, the popularity of ketogenic diets and such in India, but they're very popular in the States and a lot of other places, including with runners. And so you do, yeah. So you do see some runners go on those diets and they say, oh, I lost weight, I feel great.
Yeah, they're getting popular here.
So, well, there's that, so
Yeah.
so there's anecdotal evidence that you can get away with a low carb diet, but it's not what I recommend. So it's not it has to be 50% or it has to be 60% or I just always I say let's look at what the best runners in the world are doing and then start there. And again, you have to scale things down. If you're not running 150 kilometers per week, then you probably don't need 5,000 calories a day like they do. So it's all a matter of scaling, but you're still, sort of taking your cues from the top athletes.
Makes a lot of sense. I think we are almost at the end of the podcast. I wanted to see, Matt, is there anything that you think you would want to suggest anything to our listeners, whether any training resources or nutrition resources or things like those? We are going to provide all of your social media details, etc., in the show notes. But in addition to that, do you want to suggest anything to our listeners?
I will mention there's a pretty handy zone calculator on the 80/20 Endurance website. So if you go to 8020endurance.com and then hit the zone tab, there's some, because it can be intimidating at first. So there's some resources that will walk you through the process of figuring out, what low intensity means for you and so forth. So that's a good resource for people.
Okay, great. We would put the website link in the show notes as well. This was fantastic to speak with you, Matt, and hopefully we'll be able to welcome you again in future on another podcast.
All right, that sounds great. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. We have a lot more to offer on nutrition, training, and fitness. Check the FitPage app or visit our website, fitpage.in.